Bom dia, muito obrigada. Bem-vindos ao ISCSP. Eu tenho umas notas breves de introdução. I have some welcome notes in English, and I will welcome you all, and good morning, dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure to welcome you at this last day of their conference in the Institute for Social and Political Sciences, ISCSP, at University of Lisbon. As a partner institution of this interesting project, it is very stimulating to host this inspiring network of training the new generation of researchers recruited from European and I think also non-European countries, and it is really very important to our institution and to all of these activities. And with a vision to explore and develop recommendations for disability law and policy reform, all of these activities have a significant importance to our work at ISRP in order to increase the quality, quantity and social implication and impact of research in an environment of growing internationalization and commitment to society. Disability and Human Rights Observatory and the Social Policy PhD committed with their activities are deeply connected with the two research centers at our institution, the Center for Public Administration and Public Policy and the Interdisciplinary Center for Gender Studies. And especially the observatory that has been doing a very relevant, inspiring and powerful work. All of these institutions have been working in this relevant field, and these research centers are evaluated with excellence by the Portuguese Foundation of Science and Technology. The organization of a research project and a conference like this is paved with bureaucracies, difficulties, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all people and institutions involved in making of this engaging conference possible, and especially Paula, Campos, Pinto, to hold research, hard work and vision on disability studies. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this last day of conference and networking in the vibrant city of Lisbon. Thank you all for your participation. Muito obrigada e mais uma vez, bem-vindos e um excelente dia de trabalho. Obrigada.
Terminadas estas palavras de boas-vindas, vamos dar início imediatamente aos trabalhos e, portanto, agradeço uma vez mais ao Marco e à Romana por terem estado aqui connosco nesta sessão inicial, e vamos passar já para a apresentação do nosso keynote speaker para a sua comunicação. Portanto, permaneçam nos vossos lugares. Então, bom dia de novo. Temos aqui connosco para fazer esta apresentação principal, nós não temos uma tradução exata para keynote speaker em português, mas esta apresentação principal da nossa conferência, que é uma apresentação que no fundo enquadra tudo aquilo que nós queremos depois discutir ao longo do dia e debater convosco, é preferida pelo Dr. Alberto Vasquez, que trabalha no gabinete da Relatora Especial das Nações Unidas para os direitos das pessoas com deficiência. E neste gabinete ele é responsável e coordena exatamente a área da investigação e tem um longo percurso de trabalho na área associativa dos movimentos dos direitos das pessoas com deficiência, como um ativista, como alguém que investiga e instiga, como alguém dizia, instiga de facto a estas relações, a estas ligações, a estas articulações entre a academia e as organizações do terreno. E eu agradeço muito sinceramente ao Alberto a forma pronta com que se disponibilizou a estar connosco hoje. Foi mesmo num piscar de olhos. Eu enviei um e-mail e recebi, passado 10 minutos, uma resposta assim: tenho todo o gosto em estar presente. Sei que houve que movimentar a agenda para tornar isso possível, porque obviamente uma pessoa com o estatuto do Alberto Vasquez tem naturalmente uma agenda preenchidíssima, mas a sua disponibilidade também diz muito da importância que ele dá a estes assuntos, a estes temas, e eu agradeço profundamente essa sua presença, essa sua disponibilidade. É para nós uma honra recebê-lo aqui e escutá-lo esta manhã. Será certamente muito inspirador para todos nós. Muito obrigada, Alberto.
Thank you very much, Paula, for the invitation, and thank you everybody for being here. I must confess I feel a little bit an outsider for this discussion, and I myself I'm a practitioner rather than an academic, but I do research and I do coordinate research, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit how, from the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disability, actually we're very interested in seeing more research that is accessible and is inclusive of people with disabilities, but also how research can input policy change. So that's, I'm going to try to give you a view on that. And it's funny because today, the way here, I was thinking, okay, I actually have reference to Mark, to Rugby, to Anna, to everybody in the presentation, and everybody's around. But it's great to be here. So, just to understand where I come from in terms of my current position of research coordinator at the Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the Special Rapporteur is Catalina de Bandas. She's an independent expert that has been appointed by the UN, by the Human Rights Council, to monitor the rights of people with disabilities worldwide, which is an impossible task for one individual. So she has set up a team which is independent again from the UN that support her mandate, and so I actually work as research coordinator for that independent team that is funded by international cooperation. So what she does is monitors the progress made by states in realizing the rights of people with disabilities, but also that means bringing together both human rights and development issues, because we may want to touch upon again on this, but the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of the Person with Disabilities, is more than a human rights issue, it's really also a development tool. And as part of the mandate, we set three main priorities, which is promoting active citizenship, fighting socioeconomic exclusion, but also rethinking disability and taking from the principle of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that we really need to move towards respecting and accepting difference and disability as part of human diversity. That has been a key aspect of the man, and I think that's something that may need to be more reflected in not only research input but research outputs. So as part of that, we have done actually 10 thematic reports now, which sounds incredible, thinking that it has been 5 years. And for each of the reports, we actually have done different strategies in terms of, because the report is a short document of 10,000 words. But for what is behind is actually the interesting part, the background research that we have done. In many cases, we have conducted literature review only, but in other cases, and Maria is around here, we have actually worked with universities and research centers to commission research that will provide, and some of this research could be even qualitative research that we have commissioned in different countries to understand better a problem, because we couldn't find enough publications on those topics. For example, in the case of people deprived of their liberty, we wanted to understand better the experience, we want to understand better people with disabilities deprived of their liberty, whereas in psychiatric hospitals, whereas in prisons, whereas in institutions. We wanted to understand better the root causes behind that from different perspectives and different backgrounds. So we actually work with the University of Galway, the National University of Galway on this, in a 2-year project for this. So we have been engaging actively with researchers for this project and for this mandate. And there is one new, so we just published something on bioethics recently, which I think is going to be quite challenging in terms of the reception from not only from states, which are basically the main interlocutor we have, but also from civil society, because I think it opens a discussion that is not easy to have about selective abortion, about assisted dying, about children treatment. So I think it's going to be an interesting report to discuss. And the next report is going to be international cooperation. We're working again with a research team based in Massachusetts, trying to understand better where the money is going and how the money is invested in disability rights, including in terms of research. And of course, for the mandate, it has been key to use the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as a guiding framework. So I'm actually using for this a paper of Rambit that I read recently that I really like it because it resonates a lot with the process I had in Peru in terms of policy change. But I think the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been really an instrument for shifting. It's okay?
Está funcionando?
Estava funcionando um, depois estava funcionando o outro.
The convention has been really healthy in terms of shifting this balance of power, and I mean there has been a great agreement that this is really a paradigm shift towards a rights-based approach to disability that see persons with disabilities as right holders and not objects of care or treatment. And I think the idea of this paradigm shift and how we're actually embracing something more than just the social model of disability towards a really human rights model of disability has been, I think it has to be the starting point of this discussion about research and disability. But the convention brought more than that. I think also brought a new understanding of equality. And Teresia Dejler has written a lot on this, about how we're embracing a new paradigm that goes beyond traditional substantive equality towards a new approach we could call transformative or inclusive equality, that basically aims to change, not only focus on discrimination, but actually focus on transforming the structure and transforming systems to ensure participation of people with disabilities. And linked to this, I think another key aspect, those are takes away I just want to highlight from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that will help us in this discussion, so bear with me, which is it helps also to have a better understanding of intersectionality and how it applies in relation with people with disabilities. And when we think in terms of the great added value of having the social model, helping us to move forward in the disability agenda, and I'm saying that as somebody of the movement, it always, the biggest criticism has been always that we're missing the intersectional lens to this. So I think the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a very strong focus on intersectionality, with even specific articles for specific groups, which I think is something that's important and is going to have to reflect if we want to talk a rights-based approach to disability research, for example. And as I said before, the Convention is also a tool for legal policy and cultural change, but from both a human rights perspective, but also development. And this is a very sophisticated treaty that really helps us to understand the role of international cooperation, there's a specific article on that, the role of data collection, even the role of research, and how we can ensure that all policies, not only disability-specific policies, include the rights of people with disabilities. So it's also something to keep in mind in terms of there is a big agenda happening today in terms of not only implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but the main agenda internationally is the Sustainable Development Goals. And how we input that agenda through research, I think is something we need to keep in mind. And finally, I think the Convention pushes us it's a call for participation of people with disabilities. As Mark said, this is about the voices, this is about ensuring active involvement of people with disabilities. And the Convention gives us that, it can give us specific obligations to the states and to claim participation. So, research and disability, and there has been a long but difficult relationship between researchers and people with disability, and there is a lot of things written in terms of people with disabilities being passive research objects. But I like, 3 years ago, I think, Ada Lawson in Geneva in the Social Forum was mentioning that at the same time research, at least legal research, was key in promoting the rights of people with disabilities internationally. And you remember the report of Leandro Despuy on human rights and disabled peoples, and the report of Teresia and Gerard in human rights and disability, and how they play an important role actually in promoting and were key in the discussion and the negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I wouldn't be so negative in terms of the impact of research, because at the end research can be an instrument for social change, because it helps us to identify and challenge attitudes. It helps us to highlight discrimination and social gaps, to understand better the factors that perpetuate them. I think it really helps us to see the underlying issues behind some practices, and sometimes we stay at the level of the practice, but we don't go behind in terms of what are the social determinants that are creating this situation. It helps to define public policies and, of course, to select the best course of action. This is a very difficult aspect in terms of the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities put very high standards that in some cases there was no correlation with the practice at the state level. When we think about, for example, legal capacity, the recognition of all people with disabilities with the capacity to act in legal frameworks and to make binding decisions. If we do an exercise of mapping all the practice around the world, we wouldn't have so many examples that we can say this is the goal we're trying to achieve. So in this particular case, for example, Article 12 of the Convention, selecting the best course of action has not been an evident move in terms of from which practices. So I think also research will help us to understand better how to create this new course of actions, because we're really in a framework where a lot of things need to be reinvented in some cases. So the takeaway from this part is really that, I feel from the office, we feel research can help government, civil society, and international cooperation to achieve better outcomes for people with disabilities. And research has been really highlighted, not in the CRPD in many ways. There are explicit references to research in terms of research for universal design and new technologies, but also Article 31 that deals with data collection. It has an express call to states to collect data from research and how this is going to help to inform the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I feel that most of the discussion at international level has been limited to data collection in terms of statistics, but not really in terms of research. And then the article on international cooperation also mentions again the importance of research in terms of international cooperation, and this is important because without funding there is no research. But in general, I think many of the principles and the rights recognized in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are important and are relevant for research on disability, in particular the prohibition, for example, of medical and scientific experimentation without informed consent. So I'm just trying to build this in terms of we may need a new research agenda in terms of what, again, sitting people around. Mark and others have been working in terms of emancipatory research, towards an emancipatory research paradigm, how we do research that is committed, how we do research that empowers people with disabilities, that raise the voice of the marginalized groups, research that can be a tool for social change. And I feel today there is a big opportunity for this. There is a big opportunity for a transformative research with a new focus, not necessarily on impairment anymore, but on inequality, on discrimination, on disabling barriers for participation of people with disabilities. And that means really acknowledging people with disabilities as right holders and engaging with them in a meaningful way. So to break this relationship from the expert to the subject of research. But that also means mainstreaming people with disabilities and the rights-based approach to disability beyond disability-specific research, which has been, I think, in many cases, the most common practice. I think things are changing, and we will talk about later about some principles that are coming from the disability research community, and how we mainstream them beyond those more aware spaces. But that also means rethinking some of the current disability research agenda methods, and that means rethinking research as usual. And I must confess, I was surprised working in the international level in the last 5-6 years and seeing still frameworks and methods of research projects that are not always in compliance with the rights-based approach to disability. And it is true that some research today still contradicts basic human rights standards and place people with disabilities really as objects of research rather than active participants. And this is not really exclusive of the health industry or health-oriented research. It also involves like human rights scholars and social scientists, where you can see research that is meant to justify, for example, discriminatory practice. One topic that has come out a lot and has received a lot of criticism, at least from people with psychosocial disabilities, is the amount of research being done to justify substitute decision making, to justify deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability, and basically contradicting the new agenda that is coming from not only the disability movement but the human rights discourse internationally, and it's really harming in terms of moving ahead with the standards and moving ahead with some discussions. So I think research cannot be a vehicle for reproducing a disadvantage and oppression, and I think that's something very important to highlight. And that's why many in the disability community and the research community have been talking about this rights-based disability research, how we move towards that, which means having research that is informed by human rights, by the human rights-based approach to disability, and that means basically taking into account that disability is a social construct that is the result of an interaction between an individual and social barriers. That means that impairment cannot be an excuse for limiting rights. That means that all people with disabilities have the same rights as people without disabilities, on equal basis with others. That means a very strong focus on participation and inclusion rather than adopting a special right for special people. So how we move toward that, I think that's one of the main challenges. There is an interesting process now at the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights. They have been working in the last 3 years on indicators that trying to break down, I think it's really almost an impossible task, to break down the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the different obligations in indicators that could be measured. And then the exercise aims to provide guidance to the states in terms of how to implement the Sustainable Development Goals for people with disabilities. But I think those indicators are particularly useful also to do research that is rights-based and is framed around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But then that means also that research processes and methods have to comply with the CRPD principles, the principles of the Convention, from respect to autonomy and dignity, non-discrimination, accessibility, as I said, respect and acceptance of differences, equality between men and women. And so I think those principles have a very concrete impact and meaning when we think in terms of research processes. And that also means ethical framework that should be guided by CRPD principles. And there are key areas, I think, that are important in terms of informed consent and privacy. And then how these research outcomes, how your paper, your publication help to move the disability rights agenda. I think how it fosters the disability rights agenda. And again, thinking in terms of the intersectionality approach that the Convention demands, how research is taking into account this multidimensional nature of the disability experience. And as Anna said, how we reach those who might be harder to reach when we think in terms of research, in terms of people, for example, living in institutions, people deprived of their legal capacity, people living in remote and rural areas. So I think those are very practical and important considerations. And that leads us to this discussion about if we need a participatory approach to research. And the need to build this new relationship between researchers and participants, rather than the old traditional paradigm of parasiting, as some people call, approach to the experience of people with disabilities. But that really means transforming the way research is designed, from setting the priorities, the research question, methodologies, how we involve, and actually how we ensure that people with disabilities take the lead on this process. And this is involving people with disabilities and their organizations is important, but also is important that it's meaningful, because we have seen a lot of tokenism in terms of involving some organizations that are not going to be particularly active in the process of research, or involving organizations that may not be under a rights-based framework that is still operated in a very medical paradigm. And then, while it's important they are involved, the question is how you achieve a critical perspective when you don't involve a more critical perspective in the work we're doing. And the risk is always there. I mean, we face the risks in the office. We design research projects and we try to ensure meaningful participation of people with disabilities and their organizations. And of course, there is always a temptation from the Office of the Special Rapporteur to say, we're going to ensure IDA is going to be involved, the International Disability Alliance is going to be involved, because anyway, it's in the same building. But then, how meaningful that will be in terms of engaging with the people that actually will be affected beyond the Secretariat of IDA. So how you ensure that other members of IDA get also on board, or even more particularly, how groups for the more disadvantaged groups are there in terms of... So it's always a challenge, but I think it means really engaging in a truthful and meaningful way with organizations and being very open of the limitations also of the involvement. But really, I think a participatory approach, well done, will help us to have a more meaningful input from the diversity of the disability movement and to better understand the multidimensional nature of the experience. And then is, okay, but how this is also accessible and inclusive? Because this is not only from the perspective of having meaningful involvement of people with disabilities and organizations, but also how we ensure that the process is accessible for both researchers with disabilities, but also some people with disabilities as participants that sometimes are prevented to do so. And this is really related to the issue of legal capacity and informed consent. We have very little research sometimes on people's experiences the most serious human rights violations, because the methodologies and the ethical frameworks won't allow to actually deal with them, to raise their voices, because you need to go through the Guardian, you need to go through the ethics committee. So I have seen actually many research projects that have been rejected because of these procedural aspects of research that depart from the assumption that some people have no legal capacity and then no voice in the research process. So I think we always think in terms of informed consent as a tool to avoid that people will be abused in the process of research, but also it could be in some countries, and I think in most countries, could be a barrier also to have the voices of people with disabilities engaged. And then the publications. I mean, we can talk about the publications in accessible formats and how to achieve that. But I think there is more beyond that. It's how we move away from non-academic spaces. How we ensure that research is going to be used not just by policymakers, that I'm going to go there later, but how it's used by people that is directly affected by the things you are researching. So moving away from academic journal and books, I think is necessary in this field. And we feel that also from the office, even though our documents are more policy-oriented, the report that we produce. So then is how we cater them in different audiences. How we ensure that we have not only an easy-to-read version, but also a plain language version, or we would produce briefings that are going to be accessible and going to be simple to understand, because we're full of legal language there, and then how we translate that into something that will be easy to consume. Many actually here were involved in this Disability Human Rights Research Network. They were working on a protocol on rights-based disability research in all fields, and I think it was a very useful exercise that involved different universities and involved also a stakeholder from the UN system and civil society. And they identified 3 key principles that were important to achieve a rights-based disability research. Research that is led and initiated by the voices of the disability community. Response to a rights concern in the disability community, and that could mean many things. It could be from reports, from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, concluding observations, from many sources, but basically that respond to the real concerns of people with disabilities, but also outputs that directly address the rights concern and are given back to the community in accessible formats. So I think this document is particularly useful for those working on research around people with disabilities and the rights of people with disabilities. And this is more from the office perspective, or from my own experience at the office in terms of the new opportunities that are opening for disability research. I think the CRPD, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, have generated an increased interest on disability research, including, and I would say particularly from the international cooperation perspective. It's not clear that actually the money is increasing, but I think the priorities are changing. So many funders that we work with that actually are part of this network of different states that are working on or are funding in projects, international development around the rights of people with disabilities. The priorities are shifting. So while more of the traditional research in terms of prevention and treatment is still there, many of the money is shifting towards inclusion and mapping limitations of different practice to address the rights of people with disabilities. We have seen a high demand, for example, on evidence-based practice from policymakers. We do country visit too, so we work on these more conceptual documents or policy-guided documents, but also we do country visit. We visit countries for 10 days, and we do a background research from that, and we engage in a dialogue with governments in terms of understanding what are the priorities, what are the needs, what are the challenges, what are the main gaps, and then we do recommendations. And what comes always from those dialogues, but also in the more general dialogues around thematic reports, is where is the evidence-based practice? Because we do have scattered information sometimes. So the two questions are, what does work, what works best? And in terms of priorities, and I was telling Mark in the morning this, for example, the GLAD network, which is this network of funders, donor countries that are working together to create a more international agenda in terms of international cooperation towards the rights of people with disabilities. They started identifying three main priorities that included social protection, inclusive education, and humanitarian interventions. But then you can see also a move towards rights-based mental health, and how this agenda is changing is really thanks to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The agenda used to be how we ensure community-based mental health, and the agenda is shifting now towards, okay, but we also want non-coercive interventions. We also want now crisis support services. So I think a lot of things are coming in terms of opportunities from this shift, from a medical model towards a human rights model of disability, that the priorities are still moving, no? So we were also discussing in the morning with Mark about disability determination and disability assessment. So every country we visit, this is the main question we receive. What are the best practices in terms of disability assessment? So, and then you have, I think sometimes we don't see that at UN level, this is the type of knowledge that we need, that an agency like the ILO or is constantly requests to produce guidance to states in terms of how we ensure a disability assessment process that is compliant with human rights. So I'm just only saying that there is a higher demand than before, I think, and we have seen that through the mandate, because we have been actually receiving funding to do research. Most of the funding we have received is because there has been a research demand from different stakeholders saying, okay, you want to work on this, we will be able to supply you with funding to do research. But then also there is a lot of demand for systematization of available data and knowledge. And this is because also many of the good practices that are always presented come from the global north. So what is working in the global south, what is working in non-English context, that's an important aspect. And then you have the limitations of language and cultural limitations that doesn't help you to understand better those interventions. And I'm very positive on this, but I feel the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability has helped to shift the power balance in terms of, I think there is a lot of knowledge coming from the global south in terms of practices, in terms of taking the risk of changing legislation and policies towards a more progressive approach toward human rights. Colombia, for example, Peru, Costa Rica recently decided to abolish completely guardianship and substitute decision making. How it's going to look like, we need more research on that. But it's happening, and it's happening because some countries are taking the risk to actually advance on this agenda. So I think there is a need for paying more attention to those dynamics. But also there is a need for more mixed methods of research. For example, I'm a lawyer, so I'm sorry about that. There is a lot of theoretical research, but then how we move from there, because human rights are not about law. Human rights are broader than that. So how we move from that to apply research, and how we use both quantitative and qualitative methods. In the mental health field, one of the concerns we have is there is a lot of data in terms of quantitative data of impact, but people is not paying attention to the experience of people under those numbers, or understanding the context behind that. And I think implementing this paradigm shift that the human rights-based approach to disability brings to the table really requires, it really forces you to move towards mixed methods, because you cannot understand this complex process of exclusion without having different perspectives. And I think it's interesting too that, of course, probably this is part of a broader, you may know better, this is part of a broader agenda of interdisciplinary research, that is the trend, but it's true that these big questions and complex issues cannot be achieved without having an interdisciplinary approach. So I think the convention, in the way that how we understand disability, forces us to move towards that. But there are also the old challenges, I think. And one thing for me that is important as an advocate on the rights of people with psychosocial disability, for example, is what's evidence-based. And I think we need to problematize this concept. Because there is a power imbalance in research production. So if it doesn't come from a university, it's not research. And then how we acknowledge, for example, research coming from organizations of people with disabilities. How we acknowledge, so I think we need to problematize that, because in some areas, particularly in the most difficult areas, where change is more resistant, and I think one of them is actually the area of mental health, there is a clear hierarchy in terms of what is considered research and what is considered evidence. And it's very difficult to move those agendas without acknowledging those power imbalances. I think I already said that the need to mainstream this discussion beyond disability-specific circles, which in the morning I realized that I knew a lot of people that were already in the DART project, which is great, but it's true that also that how we engage beyond that, and we have this discussion beyond those spaces. Last year we met with Priestley in it was Denmark, it was Stockholm. Yeah, Copenhagen, sorry. And I felt so good to be in a space where actually nobody knew about disability. I mean, not that they knew, but I didn't know much of the people there, and many people actually didn't even know what was that existed something called the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and that was interesting because it's an opportunity of engaging with people that work on disability studies but don't work on human rights, and then probably were more exposed to this connection about how we ensure a rights-based approach on research. Something that is still a challenge, and this is really from my experience in the office, is the issue of data collection. And even when I worked in a research project in Peru, we were doing a research project in Peru as a rotation with people in the UK and also people in Vietnam, Vietnam, it was Tanzania. And something that came across is we really don't have comparable data. And this has been now this is a more pressing discussion at the UN level in terms of, I mean, we're collecting a lot of data. I mean, this is more in terms of statistics and states, but the data is not comparable because we're using different frameworks. Then, of course, we can discuss about those different frameworks in terms of the Washington Group's short set of questions and the limitations, but also, I mean, the World Health Organization now have this model disability survey, and there are other instruments that are being used. But then when you come down to, okay, I'm going to implement a research project in a country, in a given country, and you want to use one instrument to collect data, you can see also that many times we're not using the same frameworks, and because of that, again, the data is not going to be comparable. So I think this is an important discussion in terms of, for us that work as people that consume the research and actually commission research, it's important to get to that level to say, okay, that this experience could be comparable to another one. Another challenge also is the need for better alliance between academia and DPOs. This project is perfect for this. I know you're doing this. But policymakers, before working on this, I used to be a practitioner. So I used to do law and policy implementation, drafting laws and working with politicians and working with policymakers. They don't care about research. They say they want research, and then they will decide something else. So there is a broker in the middle that will use some part of the research that will be convenient for the different agendas. You can always do that. But it's true that policymakers say we want research, and the state will go, we want more research and evidence-based. In practice, it's difficult because they won't take your research. So if you don't design the research project in a way that actually going to impact those policymakers, it's going to be very difficult that they will use your document. And the best way to achieve that is alliance with DPOs and people interested at national level and local level that could use that as a tool for moving agendas. But it's true that, I mean, there is a lot of hypocrisy in the way we talk about evidence-based and research from policymakers. And I think I already said that low middle-income countries and the global south in general is underrepresented. Even when you think, I come from Peru, and when you think in terms of publications, so we have our own network for publications in our languages, but they don't have the impact that an English magazine, journal could have in Peru. So of course they're not going to pay attention to the regional journal, but they're going to pay attention to the Lancet. So that's what is happening in terms of, and then the thing is, we have commissioned a couple of literature reviews, for example, and then the answer is, it's very hard to get into non-English publications because we don't have the capacity. And then we can add Spanish. I think Spanish is growing. We can add Spanish, French, but then you keep going. So I think, but that should be part of a broader discussion, because you won't shift the power imbalance if you don't engage with research from different languages. And that's a big challenge. Even for literature reviews, as I said, we really need to engage with what's published there. And the problem is, because the different standards of what's peer-reviewed, then people don't take seriously those publications. And it's not the fault of the research itself, it's the fault of the system that is not as sophisticated to have double-blind peer review. So I think that's something to think about in terms of the old challenges that we're facing. From the office, we have been doing a lot of calls to states to fund more research. And every report we have done, and as I said, we have done 10, we have seen, and we have a good relationship with research centers. I mean, we're very close with many people here that work on research. And it's true that there's many gaps, and so I think from the disability movement and independent experts at the UN level, there is a lot of appetite for push the agenda, but I think at the same time we may need to find better ways to connect with the research networks in terms that we do the perfect match, that the research is there to push an agenda and it's not one catching each other, research going faster and then the agenda is not there because we don't know that's an important priority, or the opposite, that we think something is a priority that actually research is telling us that you may not want to go there because you're not going to find something. So that has been my experience, and to some extent the experience of the office in terms of working in this field between moving, trying to push for an agenda in terms of research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sounds really wonderful. Thank you so much, Alberto. E estou certa que há muitas questões, foi de facto inspirador. Também vos posso dizer que se articulou muito bem com aquilo que nós temos vindo a trabalhar nestes últimos 3 dias, na sessão de formação, na componente formativa e mais fechada do grupo do DER, em que temos estado a trabalhar desde segunda-feira, e nós trabalhámos estes temas. Acho que todos reconhecemos aqui muito daquilo que foram os nossos debates e o nosso trabalho ao longo destes 3 dias. Mas foi também muito inspirador e dá-nos aqui muitas pistas para trabalho futuro, levantando também e não omitindo alguns dos problemas, das dificuldades, dos desafios que temos pela frente quando abraçamos este tipo de trabalho. Portanto, estou certa que há muitas questões aí desse lado para colocar e que o Alberto estará também disponível para responder a estas questões. Portanto, Mary tem o microfone, por uma questão de tradução é necessário, e já temos ali uma questão.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And you just also mentioned that.
Will you introduce yourself?
I'm Han, and I'm one of the ESR in the project. My topic is about European disabled people's organizations' interactions with UN bodies. So my question is that you mentioned that you work for the Special Rapporteur's office and you produce many publications and hoping to give advice on policy making or lawmaking. I'm wondering, have you ever tracked the impact of those publications? Like, is there any country made changes because they read the publication or they take advice from you? Do you have any track that? Is there any happening? Thank you.
talvez possamos juntar duas ou três questões e depois dar a palavra ao Albert. Mais alguma questão? Eu tinha também uma questão, porque sei que tem grande experiência de trabalho também na área da saúde mental e nós aqui em Portugal sentimos que há ainda uma grande separação entre o movimento das pessoas com deficiência e a área da saúde mental. Embora haja organizações que estão a trabalhar numa perspectiva de direitos humanos também no setor da saúde mental, acho que não há ainda uma aproximação, um diálogo e um trabalho coletivo que, no meu entender, faz todo o sentido no contexto da Convenção e de uma investigação com base na perspectiva dos direitos humanos. E, portanto, a minha questão é para saber se esta situação em particular de Portugal ou se também acontece em outros países e quais têm sido as estratégias utilizadas para ultrapassar essa porque eu acho que isto é uma herança do modelo médico que nos colocava todos a trabalhar em silos, em diferentes áreas da deficiência. Portanto, isto não está ainda completamente ultrapassado.
Should I take those two?
Yes.
Maybe, yeah, maybe it would be easier. First, actually, one of the purposes of having you in the office as a secondment is we're going to try to do that. We're going to try to review the impact of those reports in terms of jurisprudence, in terms of resolutions at the UN level, but also jurisprudence at national level, in terms of policy documents at country level. From what we have seen, I think at UN level has been very positive. Other mandate holders, other experts, other special rapporteurs that you have for any thematic topic you can imagine. You have from torture to water sanitation. So you have many of them now using the reports of the rapporteur as an input. Then we have seen the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability actually has been using also our reports in terms of developing their own concluding observations. For example, the report that we did at the beginning of the mandate on participation of people with disabilities in policy making has been used in the draft. You could take some of the key aspects of that report in the general comment on participation. So I think that has been positive too. It has been challenging in other areas. So we still have some areas where there is a lot of resistance in terms of the standards. So part of the report, what we try to do is we try to set some of the standards or discuss some of the standards, and then we try to show practice, and from that we try to build policy guidance to states. We feel that the office should be this broker between the human rights standards and states in terms of how we translate those human rights standards in some more policy recommendation. So I think that has been positive. But yeah, I mean, we didn't have any formal process of, and we would like to do that because we would like to give back not only to the UN but to the disability community to learn what worked, what didn't work, but also to give to the next special rapporteur that has to be elected it's going to be elected probably around August and it's going to start in November this year. So we can take some lessons. We're going to try to do something different but similar with Colin, which is also coming from that project, is coming to Geneva, and it's going to help us to understand better the usefulness of our reports for national human rights institutions, and our work in general, and the engagement we had with them, and actually to produce some guidance in terms of how national human rights institutions can engage better with the mandate, because we felt we didn't have enough engagement with national human rights. Very articulate papers on how some people in the movement of survivors and users of survivors of psychiatry and people with psychosocial disabilities felt that the conceptual model of the social model, but also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is not enough to tackle the discrimination and exclusion of people with psychosocial disability. So this is still, at least, I'm a member of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, and this is still a discussion. Because the identity has not been immediate in terms of people shifting from a survivor or user identity towards a person with psychosocial disabilities. This is still a conflicting issue, actually. But you could see the shift, and I think that's very interesting. In the Global South and in the North has a very strong survivor identity, I mean, in general terms, but the Global South is shifting towards this new identity of people with psychosocial disabilities. And I think the main factor is there is no psychiatry, because you don't have a strong mental health system, so you take out coercion and biomedical responses from the table to some extent. So then people is actually talking about exclusion, people is talking about poverty, people is talking about discrimination. So that actually is linking people to the disability movement. And for many of us in the Global South, this has been the first time we joined the disability movement. So that has been a very positive trend in the Global South. This also reflects in terms of researchers of mental health issues and researchers on disability-related issues. When you think about, for example, research coming from survivors and from people with psychosocial disability, they're even now the brand as a different aspect in terms of math studies, and it's not really part of it. So I think that's something there. When you go to policies and practice, when you think in terms of the UN, struggles with this, because you have two voices coming from independent experts. The voice of Daniel Furas, which is independent expert, the Special Rapporteur on the right to health. He's very strong on right-based approach, but then he will stop to some point to say, okay, but we need to discuss some aspects of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that we are not sure. Like coercion. Coercion basically is one big topic. And then you come from the disability aspect, but then because at the end the problem is, to some extent, we're taking the mental health, we're jumping into the mental health agenda, but the mental health agenda, when do you make a difference between somebody with a mental health condition and somebody with a psychosocial disabilities? Some people may say just the idea of mental health conditions is a label that will create a stigma, will create discrimination, and then actually we should talk about just people with psychosocial disabilities. So just those frameworks don't apply the same as the framework of impairment and the framework of disability. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, at least for people in the ground working on these issues. And it's really a problem because there are practical implications of this. For example, if people don't identify as people with psychosocial disabilities, they won't access benefits. And benefits are meant to tackle social exclusion, but then the agenda is only focused on liberty and autonomy and fighting the power of psychiatry. But if you reframe the question, you may access that. The problem is that means accepting there is an impairment. And some people is very against accepting there is an impairment. But then you can say, of course, but it's a perceived impairment. Good. But that also means that the only way is to go through those, the gatekeeper for benefits are doctor systems. And in the case of people with psychosocial disability, the gatekeeper is a psychiatrist. And then that means you could trigger other problems. So that's something we're still struggling. And because of that, I think the agendas are still quite separate, with big issues in terms of a lot of funding is going to mental health, but little funding is going to people with psychosocial disabilities. And those are the ones trying to reframe the question in terms of rights. So, yeah.
Complex. I know, no solutions. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm Radosh, a researcher from the University of Leeds. I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit about the recent changes in terms of the reform of legal capacity and the developments in Latin America, and also the recent development in Argentina, where people with disabilities are allowed to step out of the pension scheme and seek work. So what influenced those positive developments, and what are the factors of success that you might be aware of, because you were even personally involved in the changes in Peru?
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from the Legal Research Center for Law and Society at NOVA. And I would like to know, as you mentioned, the lack of research from the Global South, I would like to know where African countries stand on legal research regarding the rights of persons with disabilities, and namely regarding the legal aspect of their legal capacities. As you mentioned in Peru, I would like to know if you have any information about African countries in this subject.
Mais alguma?
I was involved personally in the reform in Peru in terms of legal capacity, and I have been following closely other countries because I think it's an interesting trend, and I always ask myself, why legal capacity is taking off in Latin America more than in other regions. And I think that there is a mix of responses. This is one of them. You have a strong disability movement. In most countries, you have a strong disability movement, which has been reinforced since the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. It helped us to put a clear agenda all together. Like, we're going to focus on something very concrete, which is implementation of the CRPD, and that has helped to unify movements. But also, I think there is a cultural aspect that could not be underestimated. On one side, most of those countries are civil law countries and not common law countries. I think that's an important aspect, because even when you think in terms of Europe, that continental Europe has some civil law context, those countries that are now drafting or thinking are still, like Spain, is thinking what they're going to do in terms of legal capacity. We visited France, it was a very difficult mission, but still there is some people that could understand these constructions in terms of, okay, because we're very into civil law systems, contrary to common law systems, are very based on the norm, on the text. And of course, that's an oversimplification. But that really helps in terms of framing the discussions. So because you already have, and most of the civil law countries are what we call, sorry, I'm a lawyer, modest countries. Basically, they have to, the convention is part of the national legislation immediately. So most countries are also modest. That also creates a space for courts to say we need to apply the convention because this is logic in our system. So that's helps. I think that helps. But there is another aspect that is very important, which is system were broken. So when you take the guardianship system, nobody will defend the guardianship system because it never worked. You don't have actually so many people under guardianship. You have people that go to guardianship just because it's a procedimental aspect to access benefit. So when you go to the root causes of people using guardianship, you will find that most people don't use guardianship as an end, but as a means to achieve something else. So then when you take away that, it helps you to create new avenues. So in Argentina, for example, for a while, people were accessing benefits, like disability pensions, through guardianship. They took away that and reduced the pressure. and then some courts started to apply directly the convention and implement the support systems instead of guardianship. So things have been happening, but there is a cultural aspect extra, I think, which is we can have a discussion about legal capacity because we live in contexts where the rule of law is not very strong, which is true. And then you kind of, and that's a very personal take, I would like to do research someday about this, but I really think that there are some contexts where you can achieve some level of uncertainty that you can take risks, because anyway, people take risks in society. And I don't think, I see systems, and I do many meetings with governments and experts in more developed countries where they cannot accept the fact that something is not going to be part of a contractual relationship that is going to be on paper. Just to put an example, in the UK, if you get a personal assistant, this is a discussion about legal capacity. Because if, for example, you're another person that is seen not to have capacity to consent, a personal assistant won't be able to work with you unless you have some measure there. So that's the thing, because everything is around social services. When I had this discussion with some scholars in the UK about how it's going to work that in Peru, and I said, first, we don't have personal assistant. Second, nobody will discuss if you need to provide informed consent in writing to provide personal assistance. So that's not part of the discussion. And it is true that those are things that have been built to protect people from abuse, but at the same time are taking over the life of people with disabilities and over-regulating them. We don't have that in the Global South. That keeps some space to try something different, to try something new. And I think countries in Latin America in general are risk takers. When you think about different treaties, the first regional treaty on disability was from Latin America, from the Inter-American system. Then we have a treaty already on other people that come from the Inter-American system that actually includes standards of the CRPD and applies them to other people, like living independently in the community or legal capacity. So it's true that then the struggle is always implementation. But that's an opportunity. So I think those things are what is happening in Latin America in general. There is this very progressive approach in terms of, to some extent, because at the end also, when you think about the reforms, are based on a lot of community resources. So the discussion in Europe will be how expensive is going to be a new system of support. In Latin America, that was not a discussion, because anyway, we didn't have a strong system of guardianship. We don't have public guardians normally. You have some in Argentina, but this is in Peru and Costa Rica, it's basically families being the guardian. So then the reforms coming, actually thinking in terms of how natural support networks will provide the support, because they are not thinking in terms of providing services to people with disabilities, which I think is a good thing. You don't want I don't think it's a good idea to have services providing support for legal capacity. I think it's better to invest in the communities and civil society to provide that support. I think that's a better approach, and I think it's in line with the convention. But that helps to move the agenda, because of course the states are not thinking how much money I'm going to put on this. The other one was from, sorry, the other question was on Africa. With the countries we have worked with, most of them are common law countries. It's a big issue in terms of Africa is experiencing a lot of pressure in terms of implementing, and many countries from English-speaking countries in Africa are experiencing a lot of pressure to adopt mental health legislation, which is contradicting other efforts at country level to implement legal capacity, or even link, because with this approach of
mental capacity legislation, which is discussing in some countries like in Zambia, or now Kenya is going to adopt also mental health legislation. Mental Capacity Act. So this is really UK driven to some extent. Like they keep watching what is happening in the UN, in the UK, and then apply them at country level, which is a challenge. But I would be more interested in to know what is happening in other countries that are not common law. Because I think the debate will be easier in different places. But I think in the Anglo world, the UK agenda has hijacked to some extent some of these discussions in terms of legal capacity and mental health and deprivation of liberty. I don't know if you're familiar with this, the African yearbook on disability rights. I think there are some things coming from there, from new scholars that are doing good things in terms of rethinking what they could do in terms of legal capacity.
Well, I think it's time for a break. Thank you so much. It was very good.